just to contextualize D.W. Griffith's film a little bit. So, 1915, considered very kind of, almost like a classic from the beginning, even though, yes, it caused riots and people were upset at the screenings. People did also see right away that it was very different from the silent films that came before. So many kind of innovative techniques that we take for granted now that seem really obvious to us. They weren't obvious before. Like, for example, you have like something, I'm not sure if the technical term is parallel shots, but the idea that you could sort of cut up a narrative or a plot line with and sort of make it disjointed a little bit in time by having an occurrence on the screen, and then you have another shot, let's say in a different location, that's supposed to be kind of parallel, that's supposed to be happening at the same time. Like the idea that you could sort of tell a story in that way, like like you would with a short story, right? You could sort of go in between things whenever you want as a writer, and nobody's going to really think that it's too crazy. But for whatever reason, maybe because people were just getting adjusted to the idea of photography, they were just getting adjusted to the idea of, moving pictures, right? Originally, it was like photographs that were sort of set into motion in that way. It was an innovation, for its day, right? And to us, it's just kind of like, well, of course, it's easy to do. Like we see it done in all other forms of media. So people right away, right, they recognize that or artistically, even if they didn't necessarily think of it in purely artistic terms, that there was something that it was doing that was absolutely new. That said, yes, this film did cause riots. It did cause boycotts. Lots of like very famous black leaders, famous still today, that we might associate with kind of maybe a liberal orientation, right, towards these kinds of questions. They actually sort of went back and said, you know what, even if we understand, and some of them actually explicitly said this. I think W.B. Du Bois actually said this. He was like, you know what, when it comes to censorship, it has a very bad history, and it seems to always lead in the wrong direction. But I think in this particular case, it is warranted, right? And people always have this kind of idea where they're going to make exceptions for their own kind of a pet thing that they hate or they feel is kind of exceptionally dangerous. So there was a censorship campaign, and we're going to read some essays later on today that sort of characterize the response to the censorship campaign as, D.W. Griffiths decided to release Intolerance. I think it was the next year or maybe the year after, as a kind of atonement for this film. And that really was not the case at all, right? Griffith was very upset, and he was outraged at the fact that somebody would try to censor his work. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what censorship was like when it came to movies before this movie. I'm sure there must have been something along the way, but the extent, right? This was like the first, I think, very well-known instance of such, and the fact that it touched so many cities and so many states and involved so many people, right? That was also kind of new. Just by way of introduction, I'm not going to when I ask, questions about the film's racism, I am assuming, right, that the at least the depictions in the film are racist, right? There's no reason, like, even if you're going to celebrate this film or call it innovative, or even try to find some other commentary on race other than what we typically associate with Birth of a Nation. You don't have to, if you're doing that, right? If you want to do that, you don't have to, go all the way into the wrong direction and start saying things like this is not a racist film. This is all bullshit. Why did this ever cause riots, right? I mean, clearly it was a racist film, as you will see. But I do want to ask some deeper questions that I haven't seen really asked in the various essays about it, right? Even with James Baldwin, we're going to read a piece by James Baldwin on the film. It's about 6-7 pages. He didn't really bring some of this up, and maybe it wasn't so obvious in the 70s when he wrote his essay, but I think some of these questions, like 50 years after the fact, are kind of more obvious now. So the film portrays something that is called lost cause ideology. Right, this is like a form of historical negationism. When I was making the notes for this, I originally wrote historical revisionism, but I think that's too kind of anodyne of a word, right? Because revisionism is not necessarily something that is negative. It's not necessarily trying to, paint things, for propagandistic purposes, in a different light other than what the facts suggest. But negationism is that, right? Negationism is a kind of willful attempt to completely, in a pseudo-historical fashion, create a new history, right? Because you're unhappy with the first. So unlike revisionism, negationism has absolutely, I think in all cases, a pejorative sense. So we should consider this in terms of historical negationism, right? So lost cause ideology, if you guys have not heard this phrase before, it's a form of historical negationism which states that the Civil War was an unjust war driven by Northern greed, right? We have, for example, it was like a conspiracy theory at the time that all the war was about was just sort of to benefit northeastern, business interests, which, obviously like a large part of it was in fact the case. Like we actually have a history in this country of very rich people, obviously, sort of agitating for war, and sometimes even coming to, in some ways, I guess, America's rescue. I think in the War of 1812, near the end of it, there was like, a bunch of business interests that came together to sort of, help America out. But the lost cause ideology, takes it a step further, right? This is, this has nothing to do with slavery as constituted in the South, right? This is all Northern greed, right? And by doing that, right, you would also do the second part, right? You would bring the South to heel. And to be fair, there were politicians that had sort of, extremely vindictive feelings that probably went beyond like, the South is slave owning and we're not, right? Perhaps it starts that way, but there's always like a tiny nugget of truth to some of these charges, right? Which we're going to talk about. And of course, like you're going to see this in the film, willful ignorance of slavery's benefits, right? People were saying that slavery actually was very good for black people. Black people were treated well. It was like a big old family, right? And nothing is wrong with that. And in the North, you would just have a common argument at the time was, yeah, you have slavery in the South, but if you go to the North, you have wage slavery, right? So they're sort of appropriating socialist and Marxist language to perpetuate slavery, which is interesting. And slavery itself in this ideology, it's just the excuse, right? It's just kind of like the means to bring the South to heel. It's just historical happenstance that the South had slavery and not the North. So this was just like a convenient excuse towards that direction. So going into this like a question of the film's racism, this is one of the questions that I want to ask. So we could assume, right, that the film is absolutely racist to start, right? But even so, right, I think it's worth asking whether or not we could just, like with any work of art, view it as its own self-contained universe, right? You could, for example, have a poem that, and for example, Dan Schneider, he had this one poem that he talked about in his memoirs that he brought forward to some poetry workshop that he went in some university when he was like I think 20 or 21 years old. And the guy critiquing the poem said, well, what like deserts don't have dryness, right? It's just full of all sorts of vegetation. And Dan said, well, my desert, the desert that I created in this universe, in this poem, in this kind of self-contained logic, it's completely dead, right? So we could theoretically apply the same thing to stuff that is even a little less abstract. Like poetry is extremely abstract in the sense that, first of all, writing is extraordinarily abstract. It's more abstract than anything else that you could think of. You literally have squiggles on a page that if you know the code, you know the language. You don't necessarily have to be attuned in such a way to understand music, right? Or to understand what's going on before you visually, right? You could show a movie to someone that, is like part of an uncontacted tribe, for example, and they will still sort of understand, like, hey, yeah, you're showing me, I don't know how it works, but this is clearly like the vision that I would see, but it's kind of, cut up in a certain way. And here it's like this, it's this weird kind of entertainment feature. So when it comes to film, though, it's less abstract than writing. Right, you're being shown, images that theoretically they don't have to be from this world. They don't have to be from this universe. It could be a description of a universe that doesn't exist. It could be a parallel world. Like if you look at, for example, some of the film, the Japanese filmmaker Ozu, like he recycles the same actors over and over again. Many of the same situations with just like a little bit different details over and over again in his films. It has a very weird kind of well, I wouldn't call it weird because it sounds a little bit pejorative, but it has this interesting kind of quality where you do feel like you have these like alternate worlds, right? So what if we view this film, right? What if we view The Birth of a Nation as that, right? As a kind of like parallel universe where it clearly does not represent the facts as we know them, right? It doesn't represent the facts correctly about the South, about the Civil War, about racism, about slavery. All that may be false. But in his particular universe, right, in the arguments that he's making, what if we just assume that in a different world what he's saying is true, right? Like we could theoretically do that, right? There's nothing preventing us from doing that because we do that all the time when it comes to other art forms. It just feels a lot more disgusting and a lot less justifiable to do it in something like this, where we tend to moralize about these kinds of images because most people today are very much against stuff like slavery. They're against racism, at least maybe my audience. I'm not sure about most people in general, but because there's this kind of like repulsive quality to the imagery, you don't want to say like, you don't want to do this thought experiment where like, oh, let's just assume for the sake of argument, for the sake of this film, that this is a different universe. But we might have to do that. It might be okay to do that, right? And you come away with a different set of kind of conclusions, especially since, anyway, the especially since part we're going to get to in a little bit. And one of the questions that I ask is like, so if we view the film as its own self-contained universe, untrue on the facts, but following its own peculiar logic, some of the imagery, like, I don't want to be too facile about this because it could be read the wrong way, but you could, for example, look at some of the film's blackface. I would say about maybe half or more of the black or the would-be black actors are not actually black, right? Maybe more than half of them are in blackface, although he does use some actual black actors, as you'll see. But the blackface is so, and Griffith might not have really understood this, but it's kind of like not up to him, right? I mean, the blackface that was in the film is so kind of crude. It's so like you could tell that the makeup isn't really that great, right? You could easily tell that this is that these actors are really white actors. Per this could be Griffith is just kind of doing this minstrel show thing where he is championing this lost cause ideology, and so maybe he's okay with just like making fun of black people here, like maybe that's all it is, but the fact that the makeup isn't really all that great, and the fact that we can already sort of assume a self-contained universe because this is just what we do in any other art form, right? We can't simply like not assume it here because we don't like how it makes us feel. The fact that the blackface is as sloppy as it is, I mean, it does sort of suggest that, this isn't really the world as constituted in actual history that we know, right? This is kind of like its own universe, right? Where even black people, in a sense, don't even, truly exist, as it were. Griffith does not have to concede this. He does not have to be okay with this. He does not have to be conscious that he's doing this. But whether or not he knows this, like we might very well be in an alternate world. Another question that I want to ask is about ideology and propaganda. So you'll notice some surprising elements, like the fact that Abraham Lincoln, he's actually treated very, very well in the movie, right? He's treated as a heroic figure. He's treated as somebody that's doing something good and wants to look out not only for the North, but for the South as well. And actually, historically, there's a little bit something to that. Abraham Lincoln was surrounded by, it was called the Radical Republicans. And it was a wing of the Republican Party that wanted, like, for example, Lincoln wanted to emancipate slaves, yes, but he also wanted to do compensation packages for former slave owners, right? He was like, I don't want, all these people that had all these assets, meaning slaves, to suddenly, be left with nothing simply because, the status quo changed, right? And it's not a status quo that was up to them. And of course, like in retrospect, we could say that, yeah, that's kind of a ludicrous position, right? Why would you ever want to compensate slave owners, right? When you could use this compensation package to give to former slaves to start a new life, which ostensibly was what was supposed to happen, right? The kind of legendary 40 acres and a mule. Ultimately, there were no reparations that were paid out as promised. But he was surrounded by radical Republicans. Thaddeus Stevens is probably the most famous one now. He actually appears as a character named Stoneman in the film. But at a certain point, there's certain things that you can't say as history and time moves forward, right? Right now, in the modern day Republican Party, right, everybody in the Republican Party, at least publicly, right, they say stuff like, well, obviously slavery was wrong, and obviously if I was a man in the 1800s, I would never be a slave owner, right? I would absolutely be on the side of the abolitionists, right? This is what people want to believe about themselves, and this is probably not true of most people, Republican or not. So at a certain point, you have to concede certain portions of the argument because the world moves on, right? And if you're just stuck arguing something that nobody will ever accept ever again, it means that you can never gain power again. You can never use ideology and propaganda in ways that would help you out. And because of that, you have to start adjusting your arguments, right? So originally, obviously, when the Civil War started, of course, people, in political cartoons in the South or whatever, they were demonizing Abraham Lincoln, right? They were saying that this was a bad man, but you couldn't say that in 1915 anymore. Right. By the time that we get to 1915, in the entire world, slavery is considered universally as just wow, it's just fucking unbelievable that we even had such a thing called slavery. Right. So even 50 years after the fact, it was well accepted that slavery was just completely inexcusable. And Abraham Lincoln was considered a hero. You can't just make a movie where this heroic figure that is loved and popular, whether or not people understand why, you can't just demonize him, right? So, what happens to ideology and propaganda under that context, right? When society gives up that argument, right, such as Abraham Lincoln was bad, what is going to be put its place by its adherents, right? There's still going to be people that, although they might not believe that slavery was great, still they want to excuse the South in some ways, or maybe they want to excuse present day racism or whatever. So those forms of the argument, right, that are still kind of there, like being latched onto by the real believers, right? The old adherents. They go through some transformations, and we see a lot of these transformations in the film, which also I haven't really seen people comment on too much. So we're going to talk about that. Another question that I find interesting, and a lot of this is going to be the beginning of the film: did Griffith offer a comment on liberal whites? And I put liberal in scare quotes in the same way that today, I instead of putting liberal in scare quotes, I might say something like shit lib. We had, the equivalent of shit libs in the 1800s, right? Like the Whig Party that was constantly like putting forward, like they were ostensibly against slavery, especially against the expansion of slavery, but some of them were explicitly against slavery. You had all these like Whig politicians and presidents that were putting forward or sometimes becoming president that were slave owners. And it's like, well, if you're sort of posturing as the party that, in terms of like the question of the day was slavery, if you're supposed to be the anti-slavery party, but your people are like slave owners, like isn't that some sort of contradiction? And the people that are calling themselves Whigs are like, come on, guys, you got to vote for a party anyway. Don't vote for the Free Soil Party. Don't vote for the Liberty Party or these like, other third parties that are going to drain votes from our, industrious, good-hearted liberal Whigs. I whether or not Griffith himself saw this, I see this like weird strain of commentary on these kinds of so-called liberal whites that are liberal kind of in name only, and maybe might be sort of liberal in the heart, but when it comes to actually taking action, not really liberal in the ways that count. And the last part is we're obviously going to talk about some of the more technical parts and the more kind of purely artistic elements of the film. Because the film has so many technical innovations, right? Because it did so many things that to us now just sound so normal, and we just take it for granted as this is what films look like. Because all that has become the status quo now, when we look back on the film, like it does have this quality of like seeming kind of dated, which is, I've always preferred, Charlie Chaplin, for example, or Buster Keaton. Like if you watch Buster Keaton's The General now, it seems extremely modern. Like obviously, like yeah, it's a it's a silent film. Things look different. Things are not as like technically brilliant as you could get today, right? Simply due to the limits of technology. But I find those films like a lot more modern, right? The humor is more modern. The acting is even a little bit more modern. Like the question I want to ask is like when we look back right now, more than a century, like towards 1915. Do we still celebrate like the technical virtuosity, even though like some of it does come across kind of clunky? Like you'll see, for example, the iris technique, right? The iris shot where Griffith is like either starting or ending a scene, like to put a focus on it. He sort of makes everything black other than this little kind of circle. A lot of it just looks kind of clunky to me. If you were to see something like that in modern day, you would say, "Look, wow, this is this is pretty bad and a little bit embarrassing." So you want to ask questions like, how much of this has really stood the test of time? That's a very interesting way to start this, right? What exactly is he saying here, right? The dark side of wrong. Well, what wrong, right? Perhaps not the wrong that we would think. tried reading this novel, The Klansman. It's really, really bad. Much of the music here was made explicitly for the film. A lot of it was original. A lot of it was kind of like remixes of like, you know, classical pieces, which you will recognize in some parts of the film. You see Mammy here, right? It's interesting they actually call her Mammy, right? That was like the racist trope from Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this part is true. So Griffith was against kind of all war, even though he did participate in a little bit of propaganda. So I just want to go back, sorry guys, just slightly here. So Baldwin's going to talk about this later, but like just look at this beginning part, right? So the bringing of the African to America planted the first seed of disunion. Think about what it says psychologically about Griffith, about America, right? About the North, about the South, that this was like the idea, right? This was the thought, right? That bringing the African was the seed of disunion. You know, if you think about like human fears, right? Or, you know, just this idea that I would have to live alongside someone else. This is a very kind of telling start to the film. And again, Griffith might not have known at all what he was doing. But here, you know, I think in an odd kind of way, this part kind of belies like a large part of the ideology that he's trying to push forward, right? This kind of damages much of the argument in the film. And these are actual black actors, right? That's not blackface here, at least most of them. When I was talking about white liberals, the fact that this looks so condescending to me, right? How they're just sitting there, they don't get to speak. They're showing off like these are the men that we want to save. Like there clearly must have been parading the boy. There must have been some sort of savior complex here, right? The white savior complex. Like I would consider this kind of like, even if the intentions were right, there's like a shit-lib tendency a little bit. So Austin Stoneman is Thaddeus Stevens. Very interesting guy. I recommend you guys learn about him. The fact that for so much of these films, you don't get actual dialogue. You just have to imagine what they're saying. I always find that interesting. Like here, right? You have to sort of supply that yourself. and the fact that you do have to imagine much of the dialogue, like, it does give this a dreamlike quality. The fact that you see different colors, like sometimes green, red, violets, this kind of sepia thing. Right. Speaking of alternate worlds, right? This adds it whether or not this was the intention. There was some blackface there. When you read Japanese novels, sometimes you get, like, especially from like the 50s or whatever, you get stuff like, you know, a courtesan or whatever trained in the manners of like the old school, right? Everybody has this kind of golden age thinking, no matter what you look at. All the black kids seem happy. There's so many pretty lingering shots like this. That's the mammy, right, in the background. I'm so glad it's not overburdened with, you know, text dialogue, because on some level it doesn't even truly matter, right? On some level, you know, it's just you're seeing these interactions. This odd, like, premonition of the war, right? Hostilities. This like lingering shot. That kind of thing was also new. You didn't get stuff like that prior to this film. And this is very important. Throughout, like, this is kind of like, this is the North and the South being friends. And when the war starts, it's the friends and the families that are ripped apart, right? We don't spend time really here demonizing the North all that much. That's another interesting part. Instead, you get to focus on, you know, it's brother against brother, friend against friend. The friends meet in the battlefield, and they ultimately, you know, have to be in these like situations that were real life situations, right? Oftentimes you did have brothers and friends killing each other in the battlefield, right? The focus in this film is much more on that rather than just like this pure demonization of the North, although that happens a bit too. That's like a subtle snipe, right, at their kind of regional differences. Where'd you get that hat? Like, you wouldn't find this hat where I'm from, right? And it just seems so natural, right? The acting is so natural. And so this is the tinting, right? So this is also a technique that's that started with Griffith. You get various scenes tinted different colors, and you do sort of need that for a film this long. Oftentimes with like more scenic shots, right? You get like the green, like to emphasize, some of the grass that you'd otherwise, never be able to see because of, the black and white, obviously. Oddly enough, the music here sounds a little bit sad, right? But the slaves are presented as happy workers, even in this scene, right? To what extent is this like an unconscious thing on Griffith's part that we need something here that is not just pure happiness, right? But something else as well. Like the beauty to undermine, what's actually happening there. Like whether or not it's intentional, it very much has this vibe. Very happy to be working in the fields. All right, that's part of the ideology. Watch this, guys. Some in blackface, some are actually black here. But they're dancing and they're happy. The slave quarters, look at that. But in this universe, you have a bunch of primitives that cannot take care of themselves, right? And look, the white man's burden is here to, help them out in that regard. And look at how happy and thankful they are for that. And yet the music is just so well chosen. The shots are nice. Like, all of that is undeniable. And they sort of dance that out to fade it out. So we have that bloodless phrase, right? States' rights. Of course, it's never asked the right to do what exactly, right? Which is obviously to hold slaves. I'm going to try now to speak for a little bit. Just watch the kind of, acting that we get without the actual dialogue. Watch the little interactions and their engagements. You won't see this in modern film, right, for the most part. So Charles Sumner, right, another one of the radical Republicans, although perhaps not as radical as the others. That woman to the right is Lydia, or based on Lydia. So Lydia Hamilton Smith was the, I guess the common law wife of Thaddeus Stevens. Who was, she was a quarter black, I believe. It's not so obvious yet, I guess, maybe to viewers, but the implication here is that Sumner perhaps isn't radical enough for the likes of Thaddeus Stevens. And she is this kind of, social climber who will, just try to get as much power as possible. And the actual Lydia, like the historical Lydia, is much more interesting than this film gives her credit to. Right? Well, obviously, I mean, she's kind of like a little bit of a caricature in this film. I like how she's portrayed. Like anybody that is black, or even like a portly black, is very kind of lecherous and, of the body, as it were. And that great leader's weakness, it's never specified exactly what it is that we're talking about. Does he feel bad for this person? Is it something else that's going on? It's never explicitly discussed any further than this. Some of these could be like standalone little paintings, like when they were all leaving and they were all kind of waving off, and she was just kind of standing there looking very different, or something like this. You don't get these kinds of long, lingering shots that much anymore, right? Some of this film better than others, though. So watch how Lincoln is presented here. All right, he's looking out. Maybe he doesn't want to do it, right? All right, you have to act like he was pressured into it. He's supposed to be having second thoughts. He's supposed to hate the idea. He's supposed to be the reluctant one. these like red tinted, like fiery, like bonfire celebrations are going to be some of the same colors used in the war scenes, the KKK scenes. You know, like this kind of like almost like little like counterintuitive conflation of the two. I do find it interesting how, like, you know, the entire like pre-war scenes, right? They are, you know, they're so kind of celebratory, and it's especially if you're trying to do this kind of ideological comment, like it makes sense, right? That you make everybody so innocent, right? Like they don't exactly know what's about to happen, right? And what this is going to look like. And the fact that the call comes like in the midst of this, right? The, you know, presaging the confusion. You know, so many of the war scenes will look precisely like that, right? You will get the same kind of scope. You will get the same kind of mess. You will get the same kind of confusion. and all the slaves are thanking them, and they're kissing the ground, right? They're happy that the South is going to war to protect slavery, right? In this lost cause ideology. One thing that I find interesting from a kind of class perspective is, I mean, these boys, the protagonists at least, they seem to like be like officers, right? Like they seem to be like cavalry of some sort, and it's like, well, why? Why do they get to be that, right? They didn't seem to be involved in the military before this. What exactly happened? And it's part of this like building up this mystique, right, of like, the South being noble and being sort of brought down. We're sort of assuming that the boys are noble simply because of their station in life, right? They're kind of officers in the cavalry, and everybody else has to be a footman. Again, here we're back to the field, right? Back to the grass. We have the green tint to sort of emphasize a little bit of what you can't actually show. And also just remember how, like, up until this point, it seems like everything's just spent on characterization, watching the characters interact. So you immediately start to relate to them. You immediately start to like them. You immediately start to identify with them, right? This is like before we get to the fighting. This is before anything. Right, this is the strategy here. How do you make this sympathetic? Right, you focus on the characters. Right, how do you make something disgusting sympathetic? Like it's always gonna look like that, right? So after all this time spent, right, it's almost 40 minutes up until this point, characterizing these people, right, making you sympathetic towards them. Here, we're putting them through something bad, right? So, these heroes, like, even if you know better, right, even if you know by the logic of your universe that this is ahistorical in many ways, or although like some things like this definitely did happen. Here's how the strategy works, right? It's like anybody that so far is watching this, you probably are thinking like, you don't like this, right? You want to put an end to it. Like, this is terrorism, right? Not even in blackface, this close to you, right? And a lot of this is framed exactly that, right? It's the scalawag, right? It's the white captains that are exploiting the black people here, right? That they are telling, they're forcing black people who would otherwise never behave so badly towards white people because they're so happy and they love white people so much, right? But it's the white people that are influencing them to behave in this way at their behest. And I found that interaction pretty interesting, right? She's just kind of like standing there and she's smiling. She's almost excited by everything that's going on, even though these are, objectively bad things. I mean, it's kind of believable, right? That how for a few minutes or a split second, people might have this like very human response before it dawns on them what the reality is. And this is all done without dialogue, right? This is all implied and this is all, but it's all there with you. Right before the fear sets in, right? This is a fairly like believable little glimpse at human nature, even if it's not like a huge moment or anything. I mean, it's full of these little moments. The same tinting as the bonfires, right? We have this like confusion and this conflation. By the logic of the film, of the universe, you're going to have to look at all this, and you're going to have to take sides. And I mean, I know what side I'm on, right? In the logic of this universe, right? Not in historical reality. very interesting musical choices here. This is so much of the emphasis. It's friend against friend, it's brother against brother. Because again, historically, this was in fact the case. Many people were meeting in the battlefield just in this way, right? Clearly, there is some demonization happening of the North in this movie, but the emphasis again to make this good propaganda, right? You're going to have some kind of emotional attachment, or even intellectual attachment to the characters. Right? And by setting them against each other, you show the logic of the war that you hate, right? In the way that you want to show it. And even if Austin Stoneman, right, is supposed to be like a villain in the film, like for much of the film, he's not presented in a purely villainous fashion, in the sense that there's enough tidbits there where you do empathize with him and his family too, right? This is affecting everybody, right? Which is kind of the point of the lost cause kind of thinking, right? And being brought so low, right? There's innately this kind of psychological response to hating someone that, was like wealthy and sort of, gallant and gentlemanly or whatever, ladylike, being brought low. Like psychologically, human beings are wired to not accept such a quick flipping the status quo, because, if we were so willing to accept that, we would be hardwired for perpetual revolution. Right, which is not it's not conducive to building any kind of society, right? So, and knowing this, like if you're good at propaganda, you would know what some of these psychological reactions look like, and you would play upon them, like the film does. And you have to feel bad for them because, even if you know nothing about them, probably most of them, first of all, are not slave owners, right? They were just kind of conscripted into this war. And here they are kind of getting killed and eating burned corn, right? You have to feel bad for them. You kind of have no choice in this particular universe. Much of this scene feels a lot like a Bosch painting. Like if you look at, for example, The Fall of the Rebel Angels or whatever, the way that lighting is used, the way that, a lot is just permitted to be black with just some flashes of white. That's also something that wasn't done pre-1915. And just the fact that so much of this has that kind of, almost, painting-esque quality. notice how outside of the you get raids by militias, right? You get raids by black people, acting in sort of stereotyped lecherous fashion. But beyond that, the actual like true battle scenes between the armies, not the North nor the South are they're not presented any differently from one another. Again, the emphasis is always on it's brother against brother, it's friend against friend. Right, both are presented though as courageous and good in most senses. Simply because like this is just like a human conflict, right? It's men who are conscripted to do this, right? So in some ways, like it's a very kind of modern reading of war. And again, to Griffith's credit, like he was fairly consistent for most of his life on being anti-war. Yes, he did engage in like World War I propaganda at the behest of Wilson, but I mean. Just generally speaking, he was pretty consistent on that front, right? So this is a fairly kind of modern reading of war. back to the same tinting, as if this is a romance. Nobody's being demonized here in these conflicts, right? This is how good propaganda would work. In 1915, you have a united country. Like, you can't do, you can't use the old arguments anymore. And the fact that the emphasis is on the smoke, right? Like, that's taking up most of the screen. Again, very Bosch-like here. You just have these like relentless bodies just like sort of moving for no discernible reason, right? They're just, they were asked to, who knows why, right? Be honest, you feel bad for the South, don't you? Right? Wasn't that the point? How could you like not separate, the propaganda from the art, right? I mean, on some level, you have to. You have to understand what you're looking at, and you have to not be hoodwinked into one direction or the other. Like, you're not supposed to, as a rational human being, accept the cause of the South here. But you're also supposed to accept this as well written, well directed, well done, right? And in this universe, you feeling bad here makes total sense. It has to. And you do, just admit it. I do. The woman's part, right? That's a nice little phrase, right? What exactly are we talking about? Is this simply, the part of this kind of play, as it were? Is this their part of the emotion, their part of the experience? This technique for a close-up where you iris around, I find a little bit just a little bit needless, right? It's kind of dated. I don't think it's very necessary here, right? And it wouldn't be necessary today. but this is like a verbatim quote from the book itself. This does actually follow, the book, closely enough. But the book just fucking sucks. The movie's just way better. Phrase "great heart." That's also from the novel, in reference to Abraham Lincoln. And notice the way it's phrased, right? Again, back to the idea of propaganda and ideology. Like Lincoln has given back your life to me, right? You always want to keep the emphasis on the mother, even though you do other things like you clearly have a budding romance forming as well, right? You want to focus on this kind of familial strife that needless war, from the perspective of Griffith, causes. That's a nice little touch. A century later, we're still talking about state sovereignty, right? It's still it's always the talking point. Whatever fucking thing you want to do and justify that has no actual justification. You always want to put in these like bloodless terms that mean absolutely fucking nothing. This is so kind of believable, right? That somebody would do this. and yet also makes her, in terms of characterization, this makes her look so sweet, right? It's this kind of relentless thing in this movie where you are given these highly humanizing touches, kind of like, no matter if it's north or south. And instead of crying about it, he finds some humor in it too, right? This is why they're so likable. And there's so much that's communicating, just in the thoughts. I mean, just in the faces. And this part is true. The radical Republicans did not want leniency, right, for the South. Like when I say nuggets of truth, this is one of the things that I mean. And we could, debate right now, whether or not that was the right thing to go hard in the South. Personally, I think it was. I mean, you sort of have to, right, in something like a civil war with 500,000 dead soldiers and 50,000 dead civilians. Lincoln would constantly complain about the radical Republicans, and especially about Thaddeus Stevens, he would say, like, he would say things like, I'm sort of going in the same direction, but they're constantly at my heels, trying to get more and more and more and more. Right? So this part is a correct portrayal. I dislike like this use of the iris. Well, beyond dislike, I mean it's not that necessary. It doesn't really add, like, you would know eventually whether or not you saw them that those are going to be the two characters here, because here we have a close-up. And watch the way that the Lincoln assassination is being framed, right? We're going to get somebody that is supposed to be on guard, on duty, and just kind of leave selfishly to get like a better view of the play. It's sort of treated as like, here's this renegade person who has absolutely nothing to do with the context of the South, who has absolutely nothing to do with the fucking total hatred that so many in the South had for a figure like Lincoln. Obviously, Lincoln, was going to be the one blamed for the Civil War. It's going to be treated as this like completely one-off thing. Just like, the Capitol riots, like by conservatives who are like, we didn't do that. Meanwhile, it's like, well, if for months and months you say that this is a rigged election in the kind of traditional sense of rigged, well, that means there's a violation of the social contract. And if there's a violation of the social contract, guess what? You actually do have a right to go out and, like besiege the Capitol. If you believe that's true, like most people would probably agree with that argument. And they have historically, right? We've had sort of demonstrations and sieges over similar incidents in the past, right? Which nobody would say was bad, right? So constantly, fobbing off responsibility, right? So the personal bodyguard goes away, and this whole assassination, guys, it would have never happened if it wasn't for this one person. Maybe that's true in a technical sense, but let's not pretend that there wasn't this like wide or macro context for somebody like John Wilkes Booth coming out to do this, right? If it wasn't him, it very well could have been somebody else. Especially, in a time when things were that inflamed. I mean, we had people assassinated over smaller things than, a civil war with that many casualties. So see, again, this kind of, let's fob off responsibility. We're not part of this strain. This has nothing to do with us, guys. Like, we're the lost cause of the Confederacy was a lot more noble than this. This is a renegade. Right, so she's like this, stereotyped social climber. There's really no redeeming qualities to her, which actually, it does harm the film, in some way, right? Because innately, she was actually a more complex historical figure, and certainly not, evil in the way that she's presented. But again, for the purposes of this universe, this is what they're doing. All right, so Lincoln was like the best friend of the South, right? In this framing, you have to present it in this way, because if you don't, a highly popular figure who you could recruit for your propaganda is now supposed to be the enemy, right? That's not going to work, right? For the purposes of propaganda. But just like I don't get an intermission, you guys are not getting intermission either. Sorry. Very interesting kind of disclaimer here. So Griffith would constantly use Wilson's, commentary about the Civil War and alleged commentary about the film to sort of, propel it forward to get people, not only on his side, but just, watching the film too. So that other character, he's like a little bit in blackface. He's supposed to be like half black or something, and he comes to play an important role in the film. Right. So this kind of like almost like psychopathic figure, right, is said, do not bow to me because we will make everyone else bow to us. Right. So this full equality with the whites is presented as, a means by which to make the South come to heel. full equality was dangerous, right? You get the same kind of arguments today about, similar things, although they would more have to do with class, right? Or, stuff like voter rights. Like, really? We want to get felons, ex-felons, the right to vote? Like, isn't that dangerous in some way? As if, like, literally saying that you're going to, take people outside of society forever and they can never participate in society in a meaningful way again, as if that's not dangerous. But you get this kind of thing all the time, Brian. This was the 1915 propaganda that made sense to people, right? It makes sense to people because, to the extent that you had a little bit more equality in 1915 compared to 1860, people saw blacks and like, wow, why are they still so uneducated, right? People were surprised by that, right? They thought that was a good point. I don't know if that's blackface or if that's just like a naturally swarthy actor. Might be a little bit of blackface. Uh-oh. How do you think this is going to end up? Knowing what we know about half blacks in this movie. Watch this. So here's the carpetbagger, right? Trying to get the black people to stop working, right? He's trying to take away their tools, and the black people are like, "What the fuck are you talking about? We love to work for the white man." Right? And here they are just like dancing happily, and we want to make them miserable. We want to make them miserable. We want to show the world how miserable they are. The same propaganda, by the way, that is used today, right? When Republicans talk about the Democrats' racism. Now that's not false, right? There is such a thing as Democratic Party racism, but it's always framed as, oh look, black people are actually so happy doing X, Y, and Z, and they actually hate welfare. So the solution needs to be, let's eliminate the social safety net, right? But in 1915, since we didn't have like a real social safety net, and these are not the arguments that were made, like these are the arguments that were being made, right? So again, it's like it's white people that are using black people for their own ends, right? Is the way that Griffith is presenting this. Here are the big, bad, scary black soldiers, right? Suddenly they're armed, when before, maybe if you were armed, you'd be shot on sight. Now it's normalized, right? All this normalization, guys. And that's the thing. What he said is not unreasonable. The sidewalk does belong to everybody. And like this other character is made to look like this guy that is like into racism, right? whole thing taking away the implements of the black people so they could sort of be lazy and they don't want to do it. It reminds me of like this thing that was done a couple of years ago where like some conservative news site went to like random black people on the street and they were asking them this question: do you guys have ID? And of course, like most people said yes. And, it was being presented as, oh, look, Democrats believe that black people are too poor and too ignorant to get IDs for voter ID, right? It's the same kind of like, we get the same like disingenuous pattern all over, right? Just know historically where you're looking at and notice how, the patterns transform even as they stay the same. And here's like, the black mammy. Right, she's northern low down black trash. Don't try no airs on me, right? It's like the good southern black mammy, and then this like black northerner that deserves nothing more than a kick in the ass and a push. So to the extent that you get like a little bit of dehumanization of the North, like you get just enough, for the purposes of the propaganda. But again, that's not the emphasis of the film, right? Which is, I think people miss that a lot in these analyses, right? The focus is not what the North does, even if it seems like it.
And there's like a famous scene, right, where black people getting rights and representation, right, they're made to behave like total animals in the scene. Just like today when people say like, oh, why would you want, 100% of the population to be motivated to vote? That's terrible, right? It's the same kind of idea.
Watch, and you notice how like the liberals at the beginning, they were just kind of showing off the black people, but here he's just kind of like, you know, amping them up. And watch their facial expressions. It's like, just made to be like just such children. And, all these are not in blackface, which is the interesting part. And watch this. Right, this black guy's made to be so ignorant that he doesn't even want to vote because he doesn't know what the word franchise means. It's like that John Donne poem, The Flea, right? That flea sucked your blood and now sucked mine, so why don't we just kiss or have sex, right? Here they're kissing the bird. Very nice scene.
this is presented as, for example, that black guy, it seemed like he didn't deserve to vote, right? He had like a dumb look on his face, right? What would he do with a vote? But it's also true that many, Confederates were disenfranchised. I don't know exactly how high it went, but anybody that was like maybe an officer or higher couldn't vote. Which, if you think about, like, from some perspectives, it's like, well, yeah, if you're drafted in, right? If you're just part of like the army in general, and suddenly you're part of one country, and now because of a decision you're part of two, and now you're punished for it. Are you just supposed to like run away into the North? Because if the South won, it would be the exact opposite situation, right? So this is the kinds of grains of truth that I'm talking about. Like, imagine how this was experienced subjectively, right, to like a regular white person in the South who grew up with a certain kind of status quo, even if they were not personally evil. Well, suddenly, people that they had really no contact with except for, slaves or whatever, or servants, suddenly they're, riding the streets with guns, right, on horses, among other things. So subjectively, you could make the argument that this was like some kind of traumatic experience for many Southerners, which is why it would work so well. And many people that were, possibly still alive from that point, they would view a movie like this and they would say, "Oh yeah, I sort of remember it in this way." A lot of the stories that were told to Griffith by his dad. I think his dad was in the Civil War. He just sort of took that, right? So it's kind of like a secondhand account, and it's a secondhand account that comes from like the status quo reality being completely upended for them. And this lady, right? The Southern lady is supposed to, feel like things are going too far and too fast, right? This is what that part of the propaganda arm is doing. Right, and this is the fear, right? Like, imagine what this is revealing of Griffith and anybody else like that sort of accepts this narrative. They would fear this, wouldn't they? They're like, "Wow, what do you mean I'm going to be tried by black people? They cannot possibly be fair to me," right? There's always this fear, and Baldwin, not in the essay that we're going to read, but in other essays, he always talks about this fear, right? This fear in white people that, if the tables were turned, what would the black man do to me after suffering all these indignities at my hands or my ancestors' hands? All right, so just think about what this says about anyone that accepts this narrative, right? If they have that fear, right? If they do fear something bad is going to come upon them. That is a kind of admission of guilt, right? Griffith, whether or not he realizes it here, he's involving himself. Even if this is a racist film, he's sort of involving himself in this idea that he has guilt himself. Other white people that he knows have the same guilt. His father has guilt, right? Oddly enough, although you have like black people presented as savages here, in that scene, you're supposed to feel bad for the black people getting shot, right? Another example of
that Irish technique that is just, it's not, it doesn't strike me as necessarily having a point. It's just kind of like, he discovered this technique, I could do this, and, you could get a little bit carried away with it on your first try, simply because you know that you can. And that's the irony of the propaganda, right? There's plenty of black people here that you're supposed to feel sorry for, right? They have been co-opted into the narrative, right? Into the propaganda. "101 blacks against 23 whites," right? It has to necessarily be adversarial. Why does it have to necessarily be adversarial? Because there is a guilt even in this movie, whether or not anybody involved would admit it. And also another famous scene. Watch how the black people behave here. Literally like eating chicken, while trying to pass laws. Or not paying attention at all, just being too busy snacking. Or drinking liquor. Why keep Irishing that in and now, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The only thing I can think of again is like new technique, let's get a little carried away. So Gus, who is animal-like, right? He's turned into an animal by white people, right? By white carpetbaggers. They exploited him. They made him this way. Just like today you have like, liberal policies of social welfare or whatever, safety nets. That turns black people into criminals, right? It's white liberals' fault. Although it kind of is white liberals' fault to some degree, right? Obviously. This is why propaganda works so well. Both sides give themselves so much room for propaganda to work upon, each other. Stop giving people an excuse. The inspiration for the KKK is a bunch of kids, black kids, playing together with a white sheet. So again, beyond what we get, about the ideological differences between North and South or whatever, propaganda against the North, this is framed, in the kind of romantic sense, right? Of look, just like we had brother against brother and friend against friend during the war, here, we have to rip apart a kind of, a positive romantic entanglement. So keep in mind how this is just continually framed from the perspective of characters who, are otherwise kind of presented, in innocent fashion, right? Simply because, like, the director at this point knows that you have some kind of emotional connection to these people. and she again is like the sort of boundless energy, right, and innocence and kindness of the South, right, the genteel antebellum South. Although she's also not presented as some kind of stereotype or cliche. You have too many kind of like humanizing moments for that to ever be the case. In terms of like, you know, the narrative choices here, right? So Gus, this black soldier, look at that squirrel. Like Gus, the black soldier here, he has to, you know, he has to be chosen as the one that pursues this woman, right? Because you know, black people suddenly, you know, having these rights and sort of these ideas in their head, right, to pursue white women. That has to be the ultimate representation of the South being, you know, being brought down to heel. The formerly genteel South, the formerly wealthy South. And even in 1915, obviously, like, white people watching this, they would, you know, feel, you know, psychologically repulsed by such imagery. So, you know, in a sense, like, it's not just racism for racism's sake. Like, obviously, racism is a big part of it, but if you want to construct this propaganda as propaganda and make it effective, you have to look for the best possible symbols, and this is going to be it.
the stuff with these like multiple contrasting vistas. I mean, you see this in like some later films. You see this. You see like these kinds of like chase scenes in some like black and white Japanese films.
course, none of this kind of stuff was true at all. The idea that his daughter, right, would have to like. Anyway, you get the point. And the framing of all this as a fair trial. I talked about this before, but lynching in the South, it wasn't just the lynching of black people, right? White people were also lynched because lynching started not just as a means of terrorizing black people. Lynching began because there were actually like legitimate issues in the South with insufficient centralization. Like you couldn't just go necessarily to the police or a court of law with your grievances. So lots of people, and you see this all the time now, right? Any kind of like vigilante justice. Of course, this was soon weaponized into like mostly terrorizing black people. But the idea that you could get a fair trial in something that is just completely decentralized in this way, and something that has no rules, like on its face, it has to be absurd. It is ridiculous. Like there's no way for that to happen, right? The whole point of this sort of centralization is to have something that all people trust, right? Not something that subjectively changes from spot to spot with different rules and different standards and people that know the law versus not know the law, right? So on the face of it, this literally could not be, right? This cannot be a fair trial. But since we saw what happened with Gus, we're not gonna feel bad if a mob decides to kill him. Like the only reason we do feel bad is because we have the historical knowledge to know that whatever's being represented in the film, like in most cases, that wasn't an honest representation of the facts, right? Some people that were lynched were guilty of the crimes accused, but many were not, right? That's the whole reason why you avoid any kind of vigilantism, because like who's guilty and who's not always has to get obscured in these kinds of non-systems. again, the only reason you feel bad for him is because of, the historical reality and the logic of this universe. The logic of this universe is supposed to make sense, right? But even so, like, the music, right, is kind of, it's like one of those things, like, is this supposed to be a sad moment? Is this supposed to be where you cheer? Because the music doesn't give you a lot of cheer, right? The music is almost as if, like, this is not supposed to be happening, right? Another one of those, like, little, like, tells. I mean, who knows to what extent there was this kind of subliminal guilt. And this scene, I mean, you're not gonna as a modern person watch this scene. Probably even in 1915, a lot of people would be, the circle of empathy hadn't expanded so wide, even by 1915, that people would be horrified at seeing a man just kind of, thrown that way on the steps of a house. You're supposed to be dipping the flag in the girl's blood, right? The blood of the pure, the pure virgin. careful, right? Whenever you hear this phrase in the film, it's always referring to black people that are on the side, right, of the South, as it were. And I mean, think about, again, more psychological implications. I mean, just think about what that means and how the director, anybody involved in the film is like, how are they perceiving themselves? How are they perceiving black people? These are all relevant questions. And, the best thing is, like, a film like this has so many kind of like self-tells. And again, more kind of, humiliation, right? Psychologically, you are supposed to be averse to something like this, right? The man in his former glory, right? Just being kind of chopped down. And that's the thing, like, you're supposed to sympathize with the man, right? But the fact is, it's like, well, you have the scene and they seem to be really happy, right? These slaves are very happy to be getting their punishment on the slave. I mean, on their former master. Like, what does that mean exactly, right? Would they be so happy if, if he weren't guilty of something, right? Some sort of wrong. Again, like, just a ton of self-tells in this film, whether or not, Griffith recognized it, they're just here. You have that Mammy character in the back again. Watch what she does. It's like very Buster Keaton-esque what's about to happen. it's always like that idea, right? I will build this black empire. I will, construct something primarily for my benefit, and if you want to be my wife, your benefit as well. Right? Even in this film, like the only blacks that have any kind of, agency are those that are ideologically on the kind of opposite side. Everybody else doesn't really get that much humanity. But strange as it is, you definitely get humanizing portraits of some blacks, right? Some blacks that are on Griffith's, sort of, side of ideological bias here. So believe it or not, this kind of thing was new, right? The idea that on the one hand, temporarily, we have that situation going on, that scene that we just saw, and then you have this happening simultaneously, all right? Before, I guess people didn't get that they could sort of cut up scenes in such a way. And actually say that, temporarily, this is all happening at once. And, what are the cues? What do those cues look like? Notice also how we have, so we have on the one hand, this black guy that wants to marry this white woman, and of course, at the beginning, this is just kind of like presented as, the Stoneman character is happy about this because ostensibly, right, he's on the side of equality and so on and so forth. But instead, he's like one of these like shit libs in reality that as long as the intermarriage doesn't affect my daughter, right, my daughter shouldn't be allowed to marry a black guy. And it like as much as this might be a critique of that certain kind of strain of liberalism, that stuff like that did in fact happen in the past, right? I mean, it wouldn't surprise anyone that when you probably look in history, you probably do have examples of activists or fathers that feel like, or even mothers that feel, liberal about race and intermarriage and so on and so forth, mostly because they don't really think it's going to come to affect them, right? So, is that a critique of that kind of strain of liberalism? Is that a pointing out hypocrisy? Of course, the character that this is based on, Thaddeus Stevens, was not a hypocrite in this regard. He did have what seems to be a common law wife, and this common law wife received kind of like a major inheritance from him, and ultimately went on to become like a successful businesswoman. Like, she's a lot more interesting basically than this kind of like completely ahistorical stereotyping in this film presents. But anyway, when it comes to like thinking about whether or not there is any kind of racial commentary here, any kind of social commentary here that makes sense, you do every once in a while get those like little nuggets, right? That even if like Thaddeus Stevens himself wasn't that way, right? Stoneman in this movie is, right? He is not a true liberal in that regard, right? He's a liberal as far as it doesn't affect him. Watch what Griffith's solution to white disenfranchisement is. Like, it's literally threatening black people with guns. And to the extent that those, but that's the thing, like, those people that were voting, right, they weren't actually villains, right? I mean, they weren't, like, most of those black people, they weren't involved in any kind of, like, military incursions and so on and so forth. But still, like, just by that color association. I've always found that to be a bit of a silly ending with the Jesus stuff. Although, again, going back to like the kind of, a sensible anti-war message. Again, to Griffith's credit, he was a pacifist. Yes, he did get involved in that World War I propaganda. I'm not sure to what degree like it sort of left a stain in his psyche. He was, from what I've read, seemed to be kind of feeling guilty for ever getting involved. But at least there is, to whatever like moral credit that you could talk about for Griffith, like at least there is that little bit that he has going.